But to come to Australia, Steve, what can our history tell us about how we have become the country we are today?
I think one of the best things one of my students ever told me was a young man who came up to me after I'd taught a course on Australian history at where I currently teach at Campion College in Sydney. And he said, Dr. Shavura, he said, I loved Australia before I took your class, but now that after taking your class, I love Australia even more. And I don't run my Australian history classes to create sort of little nationalists. That's not the reason. But I think what he was getting at, and what I try to do, is just show how the unique and historical oddities of Australian history really explain why we are the country that we are today. And in terms of sort of major forces that historically kind of explain why Australians are the way they are, quite pragmatic, often quite fast to look to the government to solve our problems, and quite egalitarian. Our egalitarianism was noticed ruefully and bemoaned even as early as the 19th century by Europeans who came over and found that they weren't treated like they were back in Europe. I think three things really come to mind, and that is the fact that the original people who came to Australia in the late 18th and early 19th century were not Australians. This is something that I tell my students in the very first lecture. Australia was not settled by Australians. Australia was settled by the British. The people who came to Australia in 1788 had British minds, and they brought with them the ideas of the British Enlightenment, which meant tremendous respect for the rule of law and a respect for the role that religion plays in any stable, civilized society. So that was something that had tremendous influence on the Australian civil order. The other thing that's had a huge impact in Australia is, of course, what the great Geoffrey Blainey, who you've interviewed, called the tyranny of distance. The fact that Australia was so far from any European civilization at the time, and the fact that the Australian continent is so huge and generally very sparsely populated meant that there were certain things that the government had to do because they couldn't be done by private enterprise. And those things included the building of churches. So up until throughout the first half of the 19th century, colonial governments helped to build churches, helped to pay clergy, because there just weren't enough people living together for the most part to put their money together and voluntarily build these things. And so the government had to build churches. The government had to build railways from the mid-19th century onwards, where in other countries they were being built by private entrepreneurs. Government was also distributing land early on to convicts, and that brings us to sort of the third really unique factor, convictism, which gave Australia a strong egalitarian and anti-authoritarian tendency. And I think the Irish Catholics also brought that. But the other thing with convictism is that it accelerated Australia's path to democracy, not just because we had a kind of egalitarian streak in our culture from early on, but because after land was given to the convicts, it turned out embarrassingly to be the case that when the vote was introduced, when the vote was introduced to elect people to legislative councils in New South Wales, because a lot of ex-convicts had land and had made money over the years, they actually could afford the vote, and good sort of upstanding, God-fearing Scots and English and Welsh who came over couldn't. And so the great fear was that it would be a convict-dominated legislative assembly. And so basically the franchise in the 1850s was brought down so low that pretty much all men could vote, basically making a democracy out of all the colonies by the end of the 1850s. And so in order to and the other aspect of Australia's character, again, that pragmatism, a kind of anti-ideological slant, and maybe for better or worse, a preoccupation with making money, that probably goes back to the tyranny of distance as well, where when you think about it, who on earth would even come to Australia in the early days? Well, basically people who were bent on making their fortune here, who were high energy but really wanted to make money, and those are the sorts of people that came over, and those to a large extent are the sorts of people who built this country. The other thing is that, again, the tyranny of distance also meant that our religion very early on was strongly influenced, again, by Protestant evangelicalism, because the evangelicals in the 18th and 19th century in England, particularly in the later 18th century, very often couldn't find jobs in the Church of England. They were just not wanted. They were seen as, well, kind of crazy. And so the only places a lot of them could actually find jobs were actually over in the colonies. And so there was a disproportionate number of evangelicals who came over here. And so Australia, to a large extent, was a product of all these forces, but also evangelical Christianity, because of the tyranny of distance, that no one else wanted to come over here early on. And of course, all of that is documented in Stuart Piggott and Bob Linder's History of Evangelicalism in Australia. But when you understand all the forces that have made us quite pragmatic, that have made us maybe a bit too quick to look to the state, that have made us very egalitarian, you can't help but marvel at the strangeness, idiosyncrasy of our history, and I think really like it. But there's some of the things that would help us to understand why we are the way that we are.